Welcome to New Release Review, part of the Movie Friends podcast. My name is Seth. Today we're talking about Blue Beetle from 2023, directed by Angel Manuel Soto. We will be discussing spoilers, so if you have not seen this film, please be warned. Maybe go and see it and then come back and take a listen. Okay. And today I am joined by Kyle Arking. Kyle's a YouTuber. He writes the occasional article, and when I decided to do Blue Beetle, I thought, gee, who can I pull in to talk about perhaps the last film for the DC EU, right? Or no, we still have Aquaman. I almost called him Water Lad. Which goes to show you how much I know about the DC EU. I didn't even remember that this isn't the last of the movies. Anyway, Kyle, how are you?
I'm doing good, Seth. It is a pleasure to be here. As you know, I love my comic book movies, my superhero movies. DC was actually like the very first, love of my life, essentially, with Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman and the Justice League and everybody. But, yeah, I'm really looking forward to do this Blue Beetle review, and it might be the last DC EU movie if Aquaman the Lost Kingdom doesn't release, but it also, I don't even know if you could call it the last DC EU movie because it might not even take place in the DC EU. It might in fact be the first DCU movie.
Right.
So
right.
Who knows?
Right. It's so silly, like how if you were just jumping into like superhero movies, like maybe you're 12 years old, right? And you like look back on the sordid history of DC movies, it's so silly and strange and weird, where we've been in it from the beginning. And so we know what happened with like Zack Snyder, and we know what happened with like Christopher Nolan. And so we arrived to this place and we're like, okay, and now we're entering into like the James Gunn era. But like looking back, it's insane. It's crazy, like how up and down it's been and how many changes. And
it's funny because what I love to do is I love to do like my own set of archival research on the making of franchises and sequels and how a movie may have been made but then got canceled, and then how they may have started another franchise which then also got canceled. And right now I'm currently reliving the marketing and excitement for Batman v Superman back in 2016, and right now I'm about in my research about a week or two out before the release of the film. And around that time period there was a report that came out that Warner Brothers was very nervous about the film. They did not think it was going to make, like, they needed it to make $1 billion, and they didn't think it would. They thought the movie wasn't going to be a huge hit, like it was going to disappoint many people. And it's funny because you look back in 2016, they had a whole slate laid out, right? They had BVS, they had Suicide Squad, Justice League, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Flash, a Cyborg movie that never happened, a Green Lantern Corps movie that never happened. And sure enough, it is funny how that slate, most of the movies did get made. Even The Flash did eventually get made. But when we're looking at Blue Beetle, it is actually the very first DC movie created that has no connection to those prior films that were announced with that original slate. And that's a big deal because it's been quite a while since that slate was actually announced back in 2014. And the fact that it's almost 10 years later and they finally, came up with a new DC film, it's unbelievable.
It truly is, like, and if you're listening to this and you're like, hey, talk about Blue Beetle, we'll get there. But it's so wild to me to think back to you know, Man of Steel happens and we start moving towards the Justice League movie, and they just start announcing 10 movies out. You know what I mean? And 10 movies out. And then they start saying, well, actually, well, maybe now some of these will be TV shows, you know, years down the line. And well, now maybe some of these will be HBO Max exclusive movies. And like the amount of things that were announced or teased that just never came to fruition is really wild. And, you know, Marvel has announced tons of stuff, but for the most part, the majority of the things that they've announced have come out. They haven't been great, but they did actually do, you know, Secret Invasion as a TV
Even the
show. And
Inhumans, which was the
right,
only Marvel project that they ended up technically canceling or never
right,
making, still ended up as a television series.
yeah,
And you have to at least give Marvel props that they were able to, you know, make those films. But it's also the fact that you're looking at two sides of the coin. The one side is a successful franchise,
right,
and then the other side is a franchise that is slowly dying and dying a very brutal death
yeah,
that is the DC EU.
yeah. It's unfortunate. It's what I always say is like, I don't want to dislike a movie. I would love to go and see, you know, the new Aquaman film and be blown away and be excited and be happy. I always feel like, you know, everyone else is having a party that I just don't understand when I don't like a movie. And so like I don't wish that for anyone. But yeah, it's been pretty hit and miss. So that leads me to ask you this. How did you feel about Blue Beetle in terms of its place among the other DC movies, in terms of like how much you enjoyed it, or was it better? Was it different? All of that. So what did you think?
Well, with Blue Beetle, I actually went into Blue Beetle a bit differently than I went into any other DC film. And it's that really, as a fan of DC Comics, as a fan of these characters, I had really no attachment to the Blue Beetle character. He was
Mm,
actually a character that I knew very little about until a couple days ago when I
mm-hmm,
actually decided to dive into the comics and read up on the background. And I wanted to be surprised watching the film because when I was a kid, there were some heroes like the Fantastic Four, like even Spider Man, when I would see their films, not knowing as much about the character, and then those films would inform me about who these people are, and then I would become fans of those characters as a result of watching said films. And I wanted this to happen for me with Blue Beetle, so I didn't do what I did with Black Panther, which was when Black Panther was coming out. I literally read every single Black Panther comic,
mm-hmm.
um, like every single one basically, and at least every single one up until like a couple years prior to the release of the film. But
Sure.
I was like, I'm going to know everything about this character. And when I saw the film, I was like, okay, I understand that Easter egg. I understand that reference. I know what this is. I know what that is. But here, Blue Beetle, I only read a couple of comics before I went to see the film. And I have to say that I ended up really enjoying Blue Beetle. I thought the film had a a heart to it that not as many of the past DC films have had in them. Um, for me, I think some of the better DC films have been the first Wonder Woman, the first Shazam, um, Man of Steel, and I mean even Zack Snyder's Justice League, which I think all those films do have heart to those movies, but lately, like whether it's The Flash, whether it is Black Adam, whether it is um
Oh my gosh.
um
Yeah.
I mean, so many others. I do feel like they have just not landed what, when you look at Marvel, um, you know, the way that, like, say, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, how that does really grip you by the emotions. Another
Mm-hmm.
film you can mention is like, I personally think Wakanda Forever. And like, you do have these films that work. And I remember, Seth, you asked me a couple of Twitter spaces ago that, like, when's the last DC movie that you cried in? Can you think of
Sure,
one?
sure.
And I can tell you it's Blue Beetle,
Oh, okay.
because I cried like 2 or maybe 3 times watching it, and it was something I didn't expect watching Blue
Wow.
Beetle. Because going into Blue Beetle, I thought this film would be, a standard, fun superhero flick with um, a lot of funny humor by George Lopez, of course, and
Sure.
hopefully a lot of great action. But what I didn't expect was the fact that not only is the film centered around this family, the Reyes family, Jaime Reyes' family, but they are like as close in this movie as any other, superhero relationship we've seen before. Because usually when you have parents or grandparents or even siblings, they serve a particular purpose in a film, and then
Mm-hmm.
they are kind of just cast to the side. We don't
Mm-hmm.
really see much of them throughout. Um, they're there, but then they're really not. Aquaman, I could say, is a bit of an example, because, like, for instance, in Aquaman, you build a little bit of a relationship between him and his father, but really him and his father have like 2 scenes in the movie, one at the beginning, one at the end, and that's about it. Where here, what they did with Blue Beetle, I thought was exceptional, because the family helps inform who Jaime Reyes is as a character, and then they also end up saving him, or attempting to save him at the
Sure.
end,
Sure.
which I like. I can't really recall. I mean, Shazam Fury of the Gods does have a sequence at the end when the family does try to help, but it's just that I think that movie lacked that connection that this movie has, because I mean, we can go into spoilers in this,
Oh
of
yeah,
course.
absolutely.
The death of Jaime's father in this movie
Yeah.
blew me away, because I didn't see it coming. They
Yeah.
say that at the beginning, oh, I had a heart attack, and I was like, oh, that's just like, it just moved. Like, I completely forgot about it.
Sure.
It wasn't something that I paid much attention to. I thought it was just them saying that, oh, the father isn't doing well lately. But
Yeah.
the fact that they use that, they build it up, and then not only does his father die, but he is pulled away from his father by Carapax, one of the villains in the film. And Cholo is amazing in this scene. Like, I personally just felt my, heart being ripped out, because this man's father is on the ground dying, and he cannot go to him. It is just I think one of my favorite scenes in DC films. And yeah, I mean, that's really, for me, the biggest strength of the film is that family dynamic. What did you think
Yeah.
about the family?
Yeah. Normally in a superhero movie, the family serves as a little obstacle that the superhero has to overcome because they're hiding their secret identity from them, right? Or
Exactly.
I'm sorry, they're hiding their superhero identity from them. In Blue Beetle, he literally transforms for the first time like in front of his
Mm-hmm.
family. And so from the very beginning, they drop him off at the building for the job interview, and they are there throughout the whole thing. So you never have this moment of like, what do you mean this happened? What do you Oh, look at this guy on the news, and he's like, "Oh, yeah, I don't know who that is," or that whole thing of an alter ego, that's all like swept away from the beginning. And that is pretty interesting. It's pretty different for most superhero movies. To me, the movie that this most closely resembles is Iron Man, because Iron Man also had Pepper Potts. There were always people who kind of like knew what was happening. This is kind of like, to me, it's like, what if Iron Man was poor? It's like the plot of this movie, because you also have the whole idea of advancing technology to be used for military purposes or to not be used for military purposes. And one person will wield the suit and they will distribute justice, apart from like military bureaucracy. And that's Iron Man, right? Like the opening of Iron Man 2. He's like, hey, I gave you world peace. Okay, bye. You can't have my suit. So, and the other movie that this really, really reminded me of was Venom, because you have the whole idea of the two, like at one point, so okay, later on in the film, when he's hooked up to the Leonardo da Vinci circle thing,
Yeah.
where his arms looks out, Dr. Sanchez, which is, we learned is not his name, he says they're becoming symbiotic, right, as he's reading the computer.
Yeah.
It's always a funny trope to me when you there's computers in like any kind of sci-fi or like superhero movie, and someone's reading the computer as if the computer is like telling them like they've never hooked this guy up to this machine before, and the computer is expressing to them they're becoming symbiotic. Like, how do you know? But anyway, that's sci-fi. Who cares? And so it was like, the suit and the host doesn't want the suit, but they have to learn to work together, and the suit wants to kill everybody.
That
and the
reminded
host
me of
doesn't.
Spider-Man Homecoming, because
Right,
activate instant kill.
right. So you can definitely see some parallels between this and other films. Overall, I think I did enjoy the movie. The parts to me that were the most impressive were how they highlighted what it's like for families to immigrate to this country. And I think it's important for a big blockbuster movie like this to tell those stories, because a teenager might not go to see a film about migration. They might not go to see a film about what it's like to have a militarized police force break into your home and grab everybody and hit your family with the butt of their gun and drag everyone out onto the lawn with helicopters. Someone might not go to see a film like that, but they will go to see Blue Beetle. And to have those things expressed, in small moments, at one point George Lopez says, I don't like the term alien. He's like, you can use it, but in some small ways, but also in big ways, I think that it was important. And I think you could detract from the movie and say that it was used just as emotional manipulation, or that it didn't go far enough. But honestly, just that they were willing to do that, I think means something. I think that's worth a lot. That scene where they do get raided by the corporation, that was pretty intense, and that might be my favorite. Like what you were saying, where his dad dies, later on when George Lopez is Uncle Rudy, when Uncle Rudy is talking about how his brother came over first and worked, and then brought Rudy over when Rudy was like 10 or so, and how they worked every job that they could. I thought that was all very worthwhile, and they didn't have to do it. This movie could have been a lot shorter, and it could have just been kind of bing bang boom, sci-fi effects, gobbledygook action scenes, the movie's over. But they didn't do that. So I give it a lot of a lot of props for that. What I didn't like is the same thing that I don't like with most superhero films, is just stop giving us bad guys that have the same power as you. Stop giving us the same nonsense fight at the end where it's hard to tell what's happening. Every fight has to be at night. We can't see. It's just too, you have a character who's one color and a character who's very much the opposite color, so that when they're flipping around each other at high speeds, you can kind of see what's happening. But beyond that, the fight scenes just, they aren't articulated that well. There are a few fight scenes in this that are articulated well. When they're in the building under the red lights and he's like flipping around hitting people, you can see what's going on. But for every climax, it's like, okay, you could insert the ending of like a Transformers movie, you could insert the ending of most Marvel movies,
Yeah.
and it's gonna be the same amount of time, it's gonna be the same things happening. I think they had a chance to continue doing something different, and they just didn't. So it definitely lost me by that point. But overall, I think it's good. If you like superhero movies, I think that you'll like this movie.
I think what should be stated is the fact that this film was originally going to be an HBO Max
Sure. Yeah.
film,
Yeah.
and you can kind of see that in the screenplay.
Mm.
The original, like, this was a screenplay for an HBO Max movie, but then they realized how good it was that they ended up putting it into theaters. And I think the elements that are really strong are the family elements, and those are elements that don't require special effects. They don't
Yeah.
require
Yeah.
a lot of action sequences. And the weakest elements of the film, in my opinion, are the villains and some of the action itself. Because I will say that going into the film, I read a lot of reviews that discussed how they liked the action,
Yeah.
how they thought it was some of the best action they had seen lately in comic book films, and it is good. Like, it's not like this is, like, for me, I think one of the worst action movies or comic book movies that involve action. One of the worst ones was Black Widow. I thought that for a film that
Yeah.
depicted, a super spy like Black Widow and someone trained in martial arts, they should have had, raid like action sequences in the film, not, really choppy, quick action sequences that, any other director I feel could shoot. But that was a disappointment for me in that regard. And I did like Black Widow. It's just that the action I thought was underwhelming. But in the case of Blue Beetle, when you have a character that can change, I mean, he's essentially like Green Lantern. He can turn
Sure.
any weapon that he can think of into, like, he can make it a reality and use it. And I kind of wanted to see a little bit more of the variety of weapons and how he fought, because there's a sequence in that raid that we get where it's like a oneer where we see him actually fighting and using these weapons, but it's a very quick oneer. It's not that
Yeah.
long, and
Yeah.
I wanted to see I want to see more of that. I wanted to feel, when I'm watching the action, I really feel a sense of oh wow, like, I'm getting amped up here. Black Adam, I would argue, even though the movie, I think, lacks the heart that is in this film, I do think Black Adam has better action, and the action in Black Adam is, I think, more exciting, but and also visually interesting, because I will agree with you, Seth, on the ending of the film. It was a little bit hard to see, and I I I think I think, honestly, the worst action sequence I've seen in a film is the ending of Venom, because Venom. Listen,
Well,
I love the
Venom
trans.
or Venom or Let There Be Carnage, which one?
Oh, Venom, because in Venom, they look exactly the same.
Yeah, it's
The symbiote characters. You cannot
yeah.
tell who is fighting who. It is an awful, awful sequence. But no, like, I will say though, with the villains, so you have two villains in this movie. You have Victoria Cord, played by Susan Sarandon, the
Yeah.
sister of Ted Cord,
Yeah.
and you have, um, is it Ignacio Carapax? But he, like, in the comics, he's actually, I think, Conrad Carapax. But
Mm.
in here, it so okay. I'll talk about Victoria first, because Victoria,
Yeah, let's talk about Victoria.
yeah, she. So originally, this role was, well, they wanted Sharon Stone to play this role. She was
Okay.
the original
Okay.
actress that they ended up casting, I believe, to play this role, but she dropped out.
Okay.
And I don't know how far along production she dropped out, whether it was right before they were gonna shoot or nothing, but Susan Sarandon came in, and I love Susan Sarandon. She's a great actress.
She is normally amazing. She's
Yeah.
so great. In this movie, she is tasked with so much of the exposition.
Yeah.
And almost, look, she has great lines when she fires Jaime and then she turns to his sister and says, "You too, toilet." I laughed out loud.
Oh,
Like, she's
yeah.
doing funny stuff, but every line that comes to exposition, it's such a clunker. It just doesn't work. If the whole opening, as she's walking towards that big orb, I was just like, "Oh my god,
I
what
was
is this
so
movie?"
worried when I saw that scene, because I was like, for
yeah,
me, like, when you see Jaime for the first time, and like he says, you look like you are, 10,000 in debt.
yeah,
That sequence, that was when I was like, I had a sigh of relief. I was like, oh, okay, this
yeah,
movie might actually be good, because the opening, that looked like it was shot on a green screen in
yeah.
some type of studio. Like, they did a reshoot where they're like, oh, we have to show her actually, looking for the scarab,
Right,
and it was terrible. And then, like, she's like, Dr. Sanchez, and this guy comes in. I'm like, oh no, is this gonna be the bumbling science
right,
character in the
right.
movie? Because
Yeah,
I cannot stand those characters. I couldn't
yeah.
stand him in No Time to Die, and I was not going to be happy. Luckily, he isn't in the movie that much, and he doesn't really have the bumbling science type of
No,
stereotype that they
yeah.
gave. So
He comes
thankfully,
around for sure. Yeah,
he does.
yeah,
But my goodness, the opening is very rough. I've talked to many, and everyone says Susan Sarandon's basically like a Kris Jenner in this movie, which
sure.
is an interesting type of villain to feature. I think the problem with her, I think she serves her purpose. Like, as a character, I don't find like anything she does in the movie is, you know, just ridiculous and, shouldn't be there. But I think the problem with her is that, one, you talk about the exposition, how she's just spouting exposition, and we are told and not shown who she is.
Mm-hmm.
Jenny says that she basically tells us her backstory,
Right.
and it's like, I would like to hear that from her, and I would like to maybe see that from her. I think there's more to be said about, how the film portrays, women, and I do think that she could have been, because, like, both Jenny and Victoria are interesting in the way that they are both women that are the daughters of these really, prestigious men that
Sure.
have this technology, and both of them are not given the means to become the next,
Right.
heir,
Like,
you can say.
yeah,
So, like, Jenny doesn't even, like, she should, I mean, she looks like capable enough for her to get the scarab herself, but the scarab doesn't choose her. So I think there was more for them to, flesh out these characters, and to really go into Victoria's past and how she feels. Um, but I mean, I will say that it's not it didn't break the movie for me. I think that it is one of the weaker elements, but it's not like she is because I've seen other villains in comic book films that I really think um hurt their films. One of them is actually Logan. I think that the villain in Logan, played by Richard E. Grant, is just nothing. Like
Sure,
he,
sure, sure.
they don't do anything at all with his character, and I think that does lessen that movie for me. But when it comes to this film, she didn't exactly make me go like, "Oh, well, this movie is, clearly bad." Because I think the family element that is way stronger, and that overshadows that. But then there's the other character of Carapax, who I think I mean, this guy fascinates me because the whole movie we know like nothing about him aside
Right.
from this locket he keeps on looking at.
Right.
And I'm like, this is going to play some part later on in the film. I know it is. I didn't realize that they were going to literally wait till the very end of the movie for us to discover what the locket meant.
Right.
And I'm like torn on that because part of me is like, you know what? I feel it works for me because if we knew ahead of time who he was, like if we knew like before this battle, then I feel when we're watching the battle, Jaime and him fighting, it would impact us differently. We would
Sure,
then be
absolutely.
like, I don't want to see these two fight. They're both being used. But then by them revealing that at the end, I think it works because then you have Jaime realize that once again, this is a man that is Hispanic being used by these white, business people in
Yeah.
power,
Yeah.
and they are being used against each other. And I like that. But then again, you could make the argument that they really should have gone into his character a bit more because he's really just
Right.
a heavy.
Right. And like I said, like I think you could detract from this movie and say that they don't go into things enough. But it's very on the nose. Like you have this very rich white woman who keeps saying to this indigenous man who has been abused by the military and corporations his entire life, she keeps saying, I can fix you, I can fix you, I can fix you. All the while, the only reason that she has any interest in assisting him is so that she can use him, right?
Mm-hmm.
That could be explored. He could, have a voice for himself where he talks and like
Yeah.
goes through all of that. He doesn't have that voice and we don't really get that. But it's so on the nose that I kind of like let it I kind of let it go. I have a question for you because we mentioned the beginning, right? And when the movie starts, I was like you. I really don't know anything about the Blue Beetle character, the Scarab, anything like that. So when the movie starts and Susan Sarandon, touches down in like, I don't know, the North Pole or somewhere. It was very much the opening of like Captain America, right? Like, oh, we got this giant like rock orb that they're like trying to break into, and the Scarab is in the middle of that. And so I'm like, okay, the Scarab is in the middle of that. And then during the opening credits, we see the Scarab like flying through space and like destroying a planet and making its way to Earth. So I
Multiple
think,
different scarabs too. Like we see like ones of different colors.
oh,
Like there's a
do we?
green one, a yellow one, which
Oh, interesting.
I don't know much if like that is actually in the comics, but
Yeah,
I think that was more of an effect that they were going for with all the bright colors and all
sure,
that. But
sure.
it might be actually an Easter egg. Who knows?
Right. So my question is, if Ted knew about the Scarab and like made his own suits, how did that thing get into the center of that giant rock boulder thing? Like, did he put it there? Was the Scarab, is that where like scarabs come from in like Egyptian culture? Because scarabs exist on planet Earth, so it was just like, I don't know. By the end of the movie, I was like, wait, how did it get there? How did they know to find it? Why did they go to 11 different dig sites for like none of that made any sense to me.
And why is this massive object so huge and the scarab is so small? Like, is that like a lab, or is it like,
Right, yeah,
you
I don't
know?
know. It doesn't
Uh,
really get explained too
the
much.
element, like, so it is somewhat connected to the comics, because in the comics you have the same island known as Pago Island, and it is essentially like they discover that, I don't know, like the scarabs will be used for evil, and then the island is destroyed, and yet they discover the remains of the scarab on that island, and they grab the scarab, and then like that's how Ted Kord gets the scarab, and there are Carapaxes involved in that comic lore too, but it's, once again, it does feel like something that they just added in reshoots. It doesn't
Yeah.
really feel like it was that connected.
Well, like why do you even need to include like we know that Ted was the Blue Beetle, who apparently is an established hero from Jaime's area that he has never heard of. Imagine, like, yeah, I live in upstate New York. Imagine if there was a superhero, a few decades before me. He couldn't have been that long ago because
Yeah.
it's Jenny's dad, and Jenny remembers as a child him going out. So we're talking like, okay, 12 years. This is kind of like in Star Wars, how like, Han Solo is like the Force. No one's ever heard the Jedi. Come on, that's all just made up. Meanwhile, it's like 17 years ago that everything happened. But anyway, um, it just doesn't need to be just be like, okay, yeah, Susan Sarandon stole it from her brother, and okay, that's it, done. Now we don't need this huge, $1 million costing opening scene and all these weird plot holes that should, I don't know, man. So all right, I want to ask you a question, but before we move on, we have to mention George Lopez. I
Oh
feel like
yes.
George Lopez. So for me, I'm half Mexican, right? Growing up,
Okay.
George Lopez was a big deal. I come from a family that really loves comedy, and we really love comedians. And to have like, you know, this dude who was making jokes about things that we joked about and that we knew about, that was like a big deal. Like when he got his own TV show, it was like, hey, cool, all right, like a Mexican comic. In this movie, I do find him really funny. He is so over the top and crazy. And at
Mm-hmm.
first, I was like, I really don't know how I'm going to handle this. I really don't know. I really don't know if this is going to play out well. But I don't know. I really ended up liking him. I did not fully I wasn't fully on board with the whole like, hey, by the way, I'm also an inventor and I have this thing that can jam all of the security cameras in a random building. There was a lot of very convenient storytelling in this
Oh, can
movie.
I just say,
Like,
you mentioned just that. I got so tired of seeing the name Cord on
yeah,
literally
yeah, yeah,
everything in this
yeah,
movie. Like, I swear it's on like 20 things in, the first half an hour of the film. It's on the cameras, it's
yeah,
on like the buildings, I'm like, you don't need to continue to, because like, for me, it felt so lazy, like, oh, we don't trust the audience enough, that the audience needs to know how bad Court is and how they
right,
are surveilling everybody and going to take over the world. They have to be on
right.
every single,
And
device.
and again, to bring it back to the Iron Man thing, it's just like how you see Stark Industries. You know what I mean? Like it felt like they were lifting from that whole thing. It's like trying to make
Yeah.
Cord the new Stark, and it's like, okay, I mean, sure, whatever. This company I've never heard of, great.
Which, I mean, the thing that concerns me, because I like to believe that this isn't in the DCEU, like this is
Mm-hmm.
gonna be a part of like James Gunn's new DCU, because I mean, in the DCEU, it's like Blue Beetle existed, but why didn't Batman recruit him to the
Sure.
Justice League? Was he, did maybe disappeared around that time? But it's like there are some things in this movie that don't exactly work out with the older DC universe, and
Right.
yeah, but yeah, definitely. I love George Lopez in the film. I thought that for me, the audience really loved him, and you could tell that I think a lot of the audience members were, Latino. Like they probably had, because there were a lot of families at my theater, like they kids and all that, and
Hmm.
like all of like the Spanish that was being passed around, and sometimes they would curse or something like that, and the
Sure.
audience would laugh because of
Yeah.
course they would know what it was. And it really, especially that scene when when he gets the powers and he basically transforms, my theater was in tears laughing.
Yeah,
But
that
then
yes, that was good. From the preview, I was like, "Oh, this doesn't look that good." But
yeah,
the actual scene where they were like,
yeah,
"He's possessed," I was like, "Yeah, that's funny."
and then I think one of my favorite jokes was when he discovers what happened to the car and he
Yeah.
walks
Mhm.
outside and you just hear him in the, and at first I couldn't tell. I was like, wait, is someone in my theater shouting, or is that
Yeah.
someone in the movie? And then sure enough, once you realize that that's him outside, it's like, oh man, this is so funny. Then he just
Yeah.
comes in and he like throws something at Blue Beetle, and oh, it's such a great. And I loved his relationship with Jaime too, right? Because
Yeah.
it was like he's like, oh, I feel like I'm like the loser in the family, and your father's really the one. And he's like, no, you're Uncle Rudy, you're not a loser. Like, I think I was talking to somebody about it where it's interesting to see both his uncle and his father in the film. Because if
Yep.
you think about like Into the Spider-Verse, there's like there's they're not in the best relationship, Uncle
Right.
Aaron and
Right.
um Miles' father.
Right.
So it's great to
And this
see.
movie,
Yeah,
it's been getting a lot of comparisons with Spider-Man, right? Because it's
yeah,
another young, poor kid who has the powers of an insect.
mm,
But in Spider-Man, we only get Uncle Ben, and we only get Uncle Ben for a short period of time. So it was interesting to, yeah, just include the whole family. And then even, the grandmother, which I appreciated the grandmother. My Mexican grandmother was not like her. She
an
was a lot
imperialist. Or not
was she?
imperialist. A fighter
Revolutionary.
in the
Yeah.
against the imperials.
No, she was just a lot meaner. But I thought it was good. I thought the gun gag was like okay, but they just kept doing it and doing it, and I was like, okay, we get it. She's an older woman with a big gun. Like, oh, isn't that crazy? Like, okay, but it was interesting to see multiple generations. How the different family members interact with each other, and I very much agreed with her sentiment when she said, there'll be a time to cry. It's not right
Oh,
now. And
one of
then
the
at the end
best
she says,
scenes.
okay, now is the time to cry. I was like, yeah, that's very good. So, okay, my question to you, now that we've talked a little bit about George Lopez, do you feel like the way that this movie started and the way that it ended, one, do you want to see a sequel? And two, do you feel like this could easily fit right into whatever James Gunn is going to do?
I would like to see a sequel. I think that if you do make a sequel, you make it about the father, you make it about Ted Cord, and
Mm-hmm.
you go into just the family again, and you you have to, I think, because this is what Shazam: Fury of the Gods did wrong. I think when you make the sequel to this film, you have to make Jaime um and Jenny, like, you you cannot, like, well, okay, this is hard to explain, but like with
Sure.
Shazam: Fury of the Gods, what they did was I love the first Shazam. The first
Okay.
Shazam is, I think, one of the better DC EU films, and one of the reasons why it works so well is you really, I think, connect with Billy, the main character,
Sure.
and also you get his relationship with Freddy, his best friend, and his family. And I think that where the sequel went wrong was they kind of didn't they didn't focus on what made the first one so great, which
Hmm.
was when you watch the sequel to Shazam, Billy is not an interesting character. He is, I think, very irritating, and I think that his relationship with Freddy just is so different. It doesn't feel the same, and it doesn't feel like the movie that you loved, the first film.
Yeah.
Blue Beetle, I think they need to keep what we love. They need to keep the family aspect, but they also need to build upon it. And then I think they need to strengthen the villain, because the next villain they have to get has to, I think, really be just as interesting as the family. Because I think a lot of us watching Blue Beetle, we're watching Jaime, we're watching his family, but then when you see Susan Sarandon pop up, you're like, oh no, bring us
Yeah.
back to Blue
Well,
Beetle.
it's like,
Yeah.
okay, did you watch Jessica Jones TV show?
Yes.
Okay, so Jessica Jones, incredibly strong, right? Very durable. Her supervillain, Kilgore, he's not strong at all, right? He has a different power. And that's what
Mhm.
makes the two of them clashing so interesting, is because what do you do when all of your strength doesn't mean anything, right?
Yeah.
So when a lot of the superhero movies, when it's just same power versus same power, it's boring. There needs to be a contrast, and that's what makes for interesting it's what makes for interesting villains for, like, Superman, right? You know, how can anyone be how can anyone fight against Superman? And I know you really love Man of Steel. One of my least favorite parts of Man of Steel is I love Michael Shannon as Zod, but when they fight, it's just Superman versus Superman. I don't really care that much about that, you know. Give me Brainiac or even like Lex Luthor, right? Lex Luthor,
Mhm.
why is he Superman's best villain? He's just a dude, right? But he's incredibly smart. And so he can come up with different scenarios to trap Superman. And what I want to see in the next Blue Beetle movie is a totally different villain who has totally different powers. And how does Blue Beetle come up against that? Because we already know how he came up against, the Olmec. He just believed in the power of family, and that gave him strength. And he was able to. Okay, great. But at a certain point, it just becomes an arm wrestling match. Like, and arm wrestling is fun. That's, it's cool to watch. I'm not good at arm wrestling. I don't have a lot of upper body strength, but I want something more than that. You can make a character, you know, your character can do anything. It's science fiction. You can make a
Yeah.
guy who can create wormholes. Okay, cool. And that's what I did like about Across the Spider-Verse. I didn't love the movie as a whole, but the whole I can't remember the villain's name who can
The
create.
Spot.
Yeah, the Spot. Yeah, yeah. I was like, oh, I want to see this movie. And then when it transformed into, him versus the other Spider-Man, I was like, this is not as interesting. I know what they can do,
Mm-hmm.
and like the creativity level just kind of drops for me. Where when he was fighting the Spot and like he was like flying through different parts of his body,
Yeah.
and they kind of didn't really know how to fight each other. You know what I mean? That was
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting. That was a fun sequence in the movie. When it just becomes strength versus strength, I kind of check out a little bit.
I think it's
So, yeah.
also, I mean, you're talking about one, the villain has to be different. I mean, you can look at the Joker as a great example
Yeah,
because you have
exactly.
Batman and you have the Joker. But the villain also, um, I think the villain, the way that a great villain works is that they challenge the hero's perception of the world and their own
Sure.
actions,
Sure.
because like what makes I think Killmonger such a great villain in Black Panther is that when T'Challa discovers Killmonger's existence, his entire idea of his father
Right.
is uprooted from the ground, and he's now questioning his own father's actions. And I think
Yeah.
that's a great villain because
And
it changes the perception.
yeah, the actions of the whole nation that he is like sworn to protect, and the throne, and what does the throne mean if Killmonger can also be an heir to the throne? Yeah, it's exactly all of that. And I would like to see it be a little bit more creative, I guess, is all that I'm going to say. And really, that's just my desire for any superhero movie moving forward, is just stop pairing up the same powers with the same powers.
Mm-hmm.
Logan is a great movie. The final battle between Logan and himself is like not as interesting,
Yeah,
where that movie was interesting is, how does Logan handle Professor X with dementia?
yeah,
That's what's
agreed.
interesting. That's interesting, so yeah, anyway,
But I
is
will
it
say that when it comes to this Kaji Da, this
yeah,
scarab that's in, I think that if they do make a sequel, I think they have to lean way more into that, because there's like a whole alien race that this thing is
yeah,
against. And I've heard some criticism that they didn't lean into the Kaji Da enough, because like, what is this thing in his spine and in his memory? Like, how is he going to be able to navigate against an alien force possibly coming? Now, the second question you asked is how it fits into like the DCU. Like, will it work? And I think it will. I think this can clearly be a part of its own, new universe. I mean, the film doesn't reference any events from prior DC
mm-hmm,
movies. He can exist. Um, I think that they might introduce him first into the DCU in like a supporting role, maybe like what they did with um like Black Panther in Captain America Civil War. And because I mean, it's a shame to say this, but like based on the box office we saw this weekend, it made 25 million domestically.
yeah,
That is that's more than half of what um Shazam 2019 made.
yeah,
It's not even, it's a real shame, because I mean, I personally think it's a really fun film. It's just that I think DC's in a state right now where they're not Marvel. They don't have that IP that assures its audience, oh, you're going to really enjoy this movie. And then it's also a character that really is not that known. Even
right,
to like someone that myself that reads a ton of the comics, I am not that familiar with Blue Beetle. So I think it's harder for some audiences to go out and see it. And I mean, you have George Lopez, you have Susan Sarandon, but also the strike itself is, I think, because of these studios not wanting to negotiate with these actors, with these writers, they're also unable to promote the movie in a way that, because I feel like if George Lopez could promote the film, it may have done a little better than it did.
sure,
And I think
sure,
there are other actors, even the main actor, Cholo, he actually is in Cobra Kai, and it's a popular show. He could have been able to do it, but that's where we're living right now. These studios are way too greedy, and they don't want to negotiate with their actors or
yeah,
writers. So,
yeah, it's insane. Yeah, and I think it's kind of a shame that by the time DC has put out for all intents and purposes, a decent too good movie, people are just done. Like they're, you know what I mean? Like if they hadn't put out Fury of the Gods, Black Adam, The Flash, all the like
Mm-hmm.
major disappointments all in a row, by that time you spent your money, you know, if you go out to see those 3 movies and you get 1 popcorn for each one, you know, you're potentially spending almost $100 on those 3 movies. Why are you going to go in for a 4th? And so it's just a shame that by the time an actually good one comes around, people are done with them. So this is a movie that could have good legs going into its second weekend, you know what I mean? If enough people see it and they're like, yeah, it actually is good. But will Warner Brothers pull the plug and just say like, no, we're pulling this out, you know, a week or 2 later and it's going straight to streaming? It will be interesting to see. You know, I made a joke that they would do the same thing that they did with The Flash, where it was a buy one get one free ticket. Which I gotta tell you, I'm a little older than you. I have never seen that in my lifetime. That is insane, you know, and it's a good indication of, you know, how in trouble they truly are with these movies. So anyway,
I really think that I will say that I think Blue Beetle should have been promoted better, because like with The Flash, they promoted The Flash where it was like the best DC movie of all time. It's going to break the world, and I think that they should have maybe done a little bit more with Blue Beetle and not so much with The Flash, because I think the consensus right now, I mean, at least according to Rotten Tomatoes, according to many people, is that people do really enjoy Blue Beetle, even I think more than The Flash. And it's one of those films, you know, it's one of those films that I just, it just doesn't, you know, it doesn't sit right with me that they were so, you know, adamant about how great The Flash was by getting like Tom Cruise and all these people to promote it.
right.
And then you have a movie like Blue Beetle, and I mean, I don't think a single celebrity or anyone vouched for it. And I think the only one that I've seen really vouching for Blue Beetle is David Ayer, the director of Suicide Squad. And I mean, that it's a real shame. It's a real shame.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you, Kyle. Thanks for joining me. This was fun.
You.
This is the first superhero movie that we've done on this show, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm doing my work in talking about it.
You definitely you definitely saved yourself from doing a Flash review.
Yeah, no. You know, I was kind of planning on going to see it, and it never worked out. The closest theater to me is about 30 minutes away, and for its runtime and between everything else I had going on, it just didn't happen. And then it left before I had a chance to see it.
You can watch on Max this week.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know that I'll ever see it, you know. But anyway, so Kyle, where can people find you?
You can find me on YouTube. It's Kyle Arking. That's the name of my YouTube channel. I'm also on Twitter at Arking Kyle. That's capital ARKING, capital KYLE. And you can chat with me about movies and TV and all that good stuff. So
yeah, definitely give Kyle a follow. And he hosts some spaces sometimes, and you're always good for like premiere night quick spaces on new movies that have come out, which very rarely am I able to join, because very rarely do I see a movie on opening night.
I like to imagine it's like, you know, you just saw a movie with a bunch of friends and then you walked out the movie and like on opening night. Some people, of course, get mad because it's like, why didn't you wait for me? It was I don't see it till Sunday. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but like I want to talk about it now, and I don't want to wait till Sunday. So.
Sure, yeah, and then they can host their own space when that happens.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you, Kyle. This was fun. And hold on, I always forget how I end these episodes. I think I just say, anyway, thank you very much for listening. Have a good one.